When we think about operating systems, typically what comes to mind is either Windows or Mac OS. These are both popular operating systems that we use in our daily life on our desktops and on our laptops. Both of these operating systems are owned by companies, Microsoft and Apple respectively. In the technology field, however, it's very common that we will encounter a third operating system of choice, which is Linux. The Linux operating system is very popular because it differs in its structure from Windows and Mac OS. Windows and Mac OS are operating systems that we would call closed source. And what that means is all of the code that goes into creating those operating systems are company secrets. Microsoft and Apple keep those close to their chest because they make their money by licensing out their operating systems to individuals and businesses. Linux has a different principle, is that it is open source. By being an open source operating system, you and I are able to access the source code, see what makes it work, and because of the license attached to the operating system, we're able to create other operating systems based off of the original Linux operating system. Now, Linux operating systems don't necessarily just have one flavor of it. There are many what we call distributions of the Linux operating system. In this periodic table of Linux distros, we can see all of the various distributions of Linux. And there are many more than just this. But if we take a look at all of the distributions that are marked in yellow, every single one of these is a different flavor of Linux. So where you only really have one version of Windows that you're using, you can see on this page we have hundreds of different versions of Linux. All of these ones in yellow, we'll note, are descended from an operating system called Debian or Ubuntu. What does this mean? It means that all of these distributions took a copy of the Debian distribution of Linux and they created their operating system or their distro based off of that. You can see Red Hat Enterprise Linux, for example. Another example of a lot of different distributions that all started with the same thing. This is not uncommon in the Linux world. However, just because there are different distributions of Linux does not mean that the fundamentals of the operating systems are radically different. The commands and the techniques that you will learn how to use Linux are going to be applicable throughout all the different distros of Linux. So then why do we have all these different distributions if they are that similar in nature? Typically the difference can come down to design and for purpose. For example, we might have a distribution of Linux that is focused primarily on security and privacy. We might have another distribution that is focused on video recording and audio recording, and another distribution that might be focused on software development. So we have that ability in the Linux world to spin up different distributions for different purposes. And because of its open source nature, we can have these operating systems running on servers that we don't have to spend licenses for the operating system. This has in turn reduced a lot of costs for a lot of businesses who've embraced the Linux infrastructure, which is why we tend to see a lot of Linux-based operating systems on the web and in the technology field. Worth to note that Linux can also be installed as a desktop environment. If we look over here at the Ubuntu website, we can see that they have the Ubuntu server option. This is the bash shell. This is the headless option that we will primarily be working with, right? This is where we are interacting with the operating system only with the command line. But we also have a desktop environment. We can see that with the desktop environment, it is going to look and feel like a desktop that we are typically accustomed to. And even from Ubuntu's own page, we can see down here that there are multiple different distributions of Ubuntu available to you. You'll see that this recording itself was even done on a Linux desktop. And you can see there is nothing too inherently exotic about the look and feel of the desktop. It looks and feels like a desktop you're probably familiar with. Perhaps there's a bit of a different layout, a bit of a different feel. That's part of why we have different Linux distributions. So throughout this course, we will focus on primarily using Linux from the command line environment, but do know that the desktop environment is still an option.